Hello and welcome once more to another episode of Voices for Palestine. We are Arab women from Jordan who have come together in response to the atrocious attacks by Israel against Gaza and its people. Today we will be discussing whether Western media has portrayed the conflict in Gaza in an accurate manner. Nadine, I know you've done extensive research on the topic. How would you say Western media has portrayed the Israeli attack on Gaza?
Huda, there are two things that strike me about the Western media's coverage of this offensive. The first is that the mainstream media, especially in the US, is overwhelmingly biased in Israel's favor. In fact, in the first 2 weeks of this conflict, 80% of the time, the major US papers simply parroted the Israeli government position, with barely a mention to the Palestinian viewpoint. When they did mention the Palestinian viewpoint, they distorted the facts in a way to make it seem as if both sides were on a level playing field and that the suffering was equal on both sides, which is simply not the case. The second thing is the selection of imagery. It does not reflect the situation on the ground at all. So the agony, the suffering, the desperation of the Palestinian people is not being conveyed to the Western audience in the same way that's being conveyed to the Arab audiences. You know, what strikes me is that Western journalists are very good at telling you the who and what of the story, but they conveniently leave out the why behind the story.
Absolutely, and the reason for that is because their reporting is usually missing the context. Most of these news agencies, unfortunately, started the clock 3 weeks ago when the attacks officially began. Exactly. But the Palestinian people have been suffering a 1.5-year-long siege imposed by the Israeli government. The Palestinian people in Gaza have been suffering from hunger and starvation and dying of treatable diseases. When the audience is given this context, it can then begin to understand why the Palestinian people is resisting this occupation.
And when a population are resisting this occupation, it no longer becomes a war as indicated in Western media.
Absolutely.
And it becomes self-defense. And terminology is actually very important to look at in Western media, because when you talk about a war, your assumption is that you have two warring factions or two warring militaries fighting each other on an equal level. But this is not the case. When you think about the Israeli attacks and you factor in the context of occupation and siege, it becomes a war for the Palestinians of resistance and a self-defense war for the Palestinian people. Another word that strikes me in Western media is the idea of collateral damage. When Israel talks about collateral damage, the insinuation is that it is an unintended consequence of a war. But in effect, when Israel is targeting civilians and their schools and their hospitals, it no longer becomes collateral damage, it becomes systematic targeting of civilians and casualties, and this becomes more of a massacre and a genocide.
Well, what baffles me, Huda, is the silence of Western journalists and politicians in justly criticizing Israel's behavior and insisting that regardless of its actions, it is doing so in self-defense and it's justified in doing so. It's as if they're afraid of being labeled anti-Semitic or racist. I mean, Robert Fisk compares the degree of abuse faced by those who unbiasedly report the truth to the effects of McCarthyism, where there's a high level of abuse and threats facing those people. It's also very important to mention that there is quite a large number of dissenting opinions within Israelis and Jews themselves, but
Sure.
These views are never seem to make it into mainstream media, especially again in the US. It's somehow as if by criticizing Israel, they're delegitimizing its existence or its right to exist. The Israeli propagandists and the media cannot seem to distinguish that there's a difference between criticizing Israel's actions and criticizing Israel's existence. For instance, as a mother, I can reprimand my child when he misbehaves, but it doesn't mean that I love him any less. The two are completely separate.
Right, and this double standard that you're talking about is also in the political arena, and it infiltrates into the media. For example, we all know what happened to Iraq when it violated UN resolutions. It faced sanctions for a number of years. Israel has violated numerous resolutions for a very long period of time, and no such parallel sanctions were ever imposed on it. And the corporate media adopts this double standard in its reporting. And the reason for that is because it's monopolized by a few who are very strong supporters of Israel. And then the media is faced with a situation where it cannot oppose the opinions of its financial backers.
Exactly.
And if we talk about accuracy, it's very important to know that in the last 2 years, Israeli journalists have not been allowed into Gaza, and in the last 2 months, international journalists have not been allowed into Gaza.
Right.
And the Israeli government is saying that if they are to send journalists to Gaza, they would be embedded with the Israeli army. So you can imagine how accurate the information would be. We hope that through this conversation, we have encouraged you to question what you read in Western media. To learn more about what's happening in Gaza, please visit our website on www.voicesforpalestine.com.